Hi, it's Jim Martin. Today's topic is about corruption. You hear that bandied about a lot in a lot of different places, including U.S. politics. What is it? How can we define it to begin with? And I think a really solid way to look at it is gross misuse of government funds for personal projects, diversions for payouts, paying for influence, paying to get contracts, paying to get better services than other people, and these sorts of things. Frankly, corruption in that form is very common in authoritarian regimes. And it's also common in countries with weak institutions that can't control their territories. For instance, you can think of countries where guerrilla groups or criminal groups set up roadblocks and take tolls from people passing through, that kind of thing. Examples of authoritarian regimes where corruption is very common: Russia, China, Iran, Central African Republic, take your pick. If it's authoritarian, there's probably corruption there. Now, we always hear about how Finland, Norway, Sweden don't have any corruption at all. And I'm quite sure that they're close to right, but they're not going to be completely accurate on that front. And it's true. There's a lot less corruption there than it is in many other places. That said, I despise comparisons to Nordic countries because they are so unique in so many ways. When you have a country of 10 million people and an established democracy and plenty of wealth, yeah, you cannot be corrupt. It's great. But when you try to move that into a country like the United States with 10, 20 times the population of some of these places, it's just not going to be the same. What are the outcomes of corruption in these authoritarian regimes in places like Russia and so forth? It's generally either nothing at all happens because it's just part of the way that things get done, or extrajudicial punishments. When you cross people in those regimes, there's not really a rule of law, so to speak. It's who might threaten the leading class or the leader themselves. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but let's go back to the United States and think about the kinds of things that we see that might be associated with corruption. Now, one of them that came to mind for me as an academic, this is not a political scandal, and it's not an example of political corruption, but it's the admission scandal of a few years back where the celebrity rich people were paying for their kids to get into particular schools under, kind of unusual scholarship situations. It's an example of using money to obtain influence and position. The other things that I think of that are all notably examples of corruption would be in the 80s. There were the Keating Five, who were kind of at the heart of the subsequent investigations of the saving and loan crisis. And there were some pretty big names in that, including John Glenn and John McCain, for instance, who neither of whom ended up getting much more than a slap on the wrist and a scolding. But a few people did go to prison for that. Another one, book deal that Newt Gingrich made while he was Speaker of the House. There have been many House representatives that have been accused of, tried for, and gone to jail for taking bribes, usually about trying to funnel things to stuff in their districts so they can get reelected. Judges have been involved in things like that. More recently, George Santos is an example of somebody who remains under investigation for corrupt practices. The outcomes of these kinds of things are scandals, resignations, most typically, convictions, not as often, but still, or just simple embarrassment and then having to eventually step away from the positions that they might have held. So, in sum, when we're talking about corruption, for instance, in the way that people will say, hey, the Supreme Court is corrupt, or Citizens United is corrupt. Maybe, but a lot of those things are passed by legal bodies that represent the law. So Citizens United is a decision that is rooted in the law, whether we like it or not. Does it have outcomes that appear to be corrupt? Perhaps, but in the end, that's the rule of law. That's how that works. I don't have to like it, but it is a fact. Now, on the other hand, if you have people getting investigated, losing their jobs, being convicted of corruption, corruption is probably less of a problem. If you observe corruption where it's just business as usual to have to pay off the local policeman, to have to pay the local inspector to get your contract approved, if you have to pay off the dictator in order to preserve your position, that's the kind of corruption we're talking about, where that just happens systemically, endemically. It really hurts efficiency and innovation because really the only people who end up getting the contracts and getting the work, that's one side of it. Or when you see situations like recently in China, there have been a few efforts to root out corruption, and we're going to have a big push to get rid of corruption. Really, what that is purging. So what they're doing is getting rid of people that can threaten the central power. That's kind of the situation where you have endemic, systemic corruption. The kinds of things that we see happening in the United States, while unethical, illegal sometimes, often result in investigations, prosecutions, judgments, jail time, at the very least, dismissal, resignations, etc. So in this country, resignation, forgot to mention Bob Menendez, probably going to jail at some point, allegedly. These kinds of things happen. At the same time, you have an overarching system of law enforcement that is looking at these things, doing these investigations, and catching some of the people and prosecuting them. Different sort of level of corruption than what we see in Russia, China, etc. At any rate, I hope that's helpful. Please subscribe if you'd like to keep up with what I'm doing, and hope you have a great day. Thank you very much.